Well, welcome back to the next session of this afternoon's West Cork History Festival. I'm delighted to be introducing Professor Melissa Fegan, currently at the University of Chester, but somebody who's written compellingly about the literature that was provoked, I suppose is the right word, by the famine. She's written what is, I think, the definitive book on that subject, and written about a wide variety of writers, both Irish and British and indeed international writers beyond these islands and their response to the famine. And she's now going to share with us some reflections on the literature provoked by Black 47 and the other years of the famine. Melissa Fegan.
I don't think I'm tall enough, unfortunately. Is it going to move? Okay, yeah, great, thank you. Right, well, thank you very much, Simon, and thanks so much for inviting me to this absolutely brilliant festival, particularly as I'm a non-historian. So what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the literature of the famine, and in particular, some contemporary historical novels that use the famine. There is a strangely persistent myth that literary writers have in some way ignored or shied away from the famine, and that despite the fact that there have been a number of bookland studies since the 1990s by scholars such as Christopher Morash, Margaret Kelleher, Marguerite Corporel, and myself, demonstrating that that's untrue. And in fact, that the famine inspired a wealth of creative writing from the 1840s to the present day. Every couple of years, it seems, a new famine novel is published, and the reviewers and interviewers will marvel that there is so much silence surrounding the famine in literature, and that the author will frequently agree with them that there is a silence and that they are breaking that silence. So if we could have the next slide, please. When Joseph O'Connor published Star of the Sea in 2002, Terry Eagleton, reviewing it in The Guardian, wondered why the famine had inspired surprisingly little imaginative writing. He says there's a powerful novel by Liam O'Flaherty and a starkly moving drama by the contemporary playwright Tom Murphy. But in both Yeats and Joyce, it is no more than a dim resonance. It is as though African Americans were to maintain an embarrassed silence about the slave trade. Indeed, O'Connor himself said that his novel was partly a response to Eagleton's earlier statement in Heathcliff and the Great Hunger, that there is a handful of novels and a body of poems about the famine, but few truly distinguished works. Where is the famine in the literature of the revival? Where is it in Joyce? And O'Connor says this question implicitly threw down a challenge to him as a novelist. Okay, in 2019, Paul Lynch, the author of Grace, was interviewed on French television because his novel had just been translated into French, and it appeared very little had changed. The interviewer, Eve Jackson, says the famine's a very significant moment in Ireland, in the history of Ireland, but lots of writers have problems with it. It's kind of struck you dumb or something, hasn't it? And Lynch goes on to explain, the famine is our great national trauma, and there's also silence surrounding the famine, because while we have this extraordinary amount of historical evidence, statistical, economical, political research and evidence, there's a gap in the record of real testimony from people on the ground, because the people who survived it, they just didn't speak about it, and perhaps they couldn't write, and the people who died took their stories to the grave. And so there is this silence. And there is a gap in Irish writing. There are some novels, but there aren't that many modern novelists who've attempted to take it on. And it's a very daunting subject because it is our great national trauma, and it takes the novelist into a very dark place. So we can have the next slide, please. However, if we think about just the decades before the publication of Star of the Sea, and between its publication and that of Grace, so between about 1990 and 2017, there had in fact been numerous novels published about the famine. And I've given a sample of some of these on the slide. And these are only the ones that would have been given a lot of attention in reviews or that made it onto the bestseller lists, or that were given awards. So we might expect some awareness of them from the kind of interviewers and from the writers themselves. And since then, we've had Marita Conlon McKenna's The Hungry Road, which I'm sure many of you know is set partly in Skibbereen, and one of his characters is Dr. Dan Donovan, and who uses the Widow Keating episode that Brendan mentioned earlier. And more recently, Declan O'Rourke has published The Pawnbroker's Reward last year. There are many, many others, and that's only thinking about novels. So there are responses in poetry, including collections by Margaret Maeve. Her collection Tenant was published in 1999. Jerry McCormack's Marrowbone of Memory in 2012. Sherry Smith's Famished in 2019. We've also got Cormac O'Grada's anthology of Irish folklore and songs on Droghol, and plays such as Jackie McCarrick's Belfast Girls, and many novels which are not directly about the famine and yet invoke it as a metaphor or an analogy, or make a direct link with the famine through setting, or that talk about the aftermath of the famine in some way. So I'm thinking there about novels like Tana French's The Likeness, or Donal Ryan's The Spinning Heart, and Anne Enright's The Green Road, or Emma Donohue's The Wonder. So perhaps the reason why this wealth of literary response is overlooked goes back to Eagleton's statements that there are few truly distinguished works, he says, about the famine, which suggests there's a particular standard of literary quality that needs to be met. It's not that literature doesn't exist, but that the right writers aren't producing it. If Yeats and Joyce don't talk about the famine, then nobody talked about it. It's the canon that really matters. And this overlooks a great deal of literature and genre that have not always been considered seriously by academics, and yet may have a wide readership, including historical romances, detective novels, horror novels, graphic novels, children's literature. But if we move to the next slide, please. George Cusack and Sarah Goss have edited a collection called Hungry Words, Images of Famine in the Irish Canon, demonstrating that famine is evident in the canon too, if you look for it, that it's there in works by writers such as Mariah Edgeworth, Anthony Trollope, Bram Stoker, W.B. Yeats, J.M. Singh, James Joyce, Frank O'Connor, Tom Murphy, Evan Boland. The problem, they suggest, is not that the literature doesn't exist, but it will never really be adequate. So they say to look at the body of writing about the famine is to see attempt after attempt to find the proper historical, political, mathematical, social, or literary lens through which the thing itself will finally come into focus. The seemingly endless appetite for new material on the famine points to a paradox. We of the scholarly and literary public clearly want the famine defined for us, and yet we seem to accept that no depiction of the famine will ever fully satisfy this desire. So the question really isn't why writers are silent about the famine, because they're not, but why they're compelled to return to it and to seek to define it for readers. The earliest writers to respond to the famine felt that their intervention might be crucial, either to change government strategies or to bring about a revolution that would place decisions in Irish hands, or to overturn prejudices that might discourage philanthropy. So if we could think about the next slide, please. In 1847, William Carleton dedicated The Black Prophet to the Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, in the hope that, as it is the first tale of Irish famine that was ever dedicated to an English Prime Minister, your Lordship's enlarged and enlightened policy will put it out of the power of any succeeding author ever to write another. For young Ireland poets such as Speranza, the future Lady Wilde, the famine dead were a ghastly spectral army to recruit others to the nationalist cause. Mariah Edgeworth's 1848 tale Orlandino and the Cork writer Mary Ann Hoare's collection of short stories Shamrock Leaves were written to attract donations. Edgeworth had previously resolved not to write any more stories about children, but she said, the temptation they held out to me of paying immediately what I might give to the poor, then in great distress, changed her mind. Kaur published her famine stories in English periodicals to counter misinformation and to press home the horrors that were being endured, and in particular by children. Later writers had their own agenda. Christopher Morash has argued that writing about the famine is a process of claiming the dead, which inscribes the dead in discourses other than that of famine per se. Famine novels were written by evangelical Protestants promoting conversion and by Catholic priests for the purposes of devotional revolution. They were written by nationalist writers demonstrating why the Union was a disaster and by unionist writers to argue that it was beneficial. The famine frequently resurfaces in literature at moments of conflict or change. Mildred Darby's 1910 novel, The Hunger, reflects anxieties about the possibility of home rule. She begins with a dedication to all the children of the British Empire, and she ends with a defense of the Union, her acknowledgement of the blood-red scars of the memory of the famine and the widespread bitterness against the government seems aimed at a purgation, that in a sense she's trying to exorcise this past so as to persuade people that we are all brothers and sisters and we can remain within this union. Conversely, Louis J. Walsh wrote a novel about the famine in 1919 called The Next Time, and it serves as a reminder of the horrors and a memory of the 1848 rising and thinking about the cost of the failure of that rising. And he's writing, of course, in the eve of the War of Independence. The historical novel, Jerome de Groot notes, can be a tool for national self-definition, but it can also be a critical form that emerges from conflicted histories. Historical fiction, he says, provides a space for political intervention and reclamation, for innovation and destabilization. Historical fiction can report from places made marginal and present a dissident or dissenting account of the past. The historical novel can advocate ideological positions, mourn a lost history, or attack the mainstream version of events for polemical and political purposes. So particular historical events recur in Irish literature and literature written by other writers from other countries about Ireland. So 1798, of course, 1916, but also the famine. They've proven particularly resilient in memory and in national self-definition. Eve Patton argues that Irish fiction since the 1980s has used history for the subversion of official and causal narratives of the modern nation's evolution. And we can see that kind of subversion. We can see that subversion in famine fiction even early in the 20th century. So, for instance, in Sean Whalen's Midsummer Night Madness in 1832, the incendiaries burning the big house were told that their memories are full of the days when their people died of starvation by the roadsides and the big houses looked on in portly indifference. But they're mocked by the narrator, who's also a protagonist within that story. He says they're just cowards who have burned a couple of old women out in the middle of the night. Derek Hand suggests that Liam O'Flaherty's Famine was a critique of the bourgeois conservative elites of the 1930s, for whom the famine was a subject farthest from their minds. And the novel was a reminder that the basic principles of justice and civil equality that had so signally failed during the famine were still not to the fore in this new order. At the end of that novel, the Kilmartins are dead or emigrated, while Tony Hines, who is the son of the meal merchant and the grandson of an informer, will go on to have Clogher in his big pocket. A resurgence of famine literature in the 1990s and early decades of the 21st century can be linked not only to the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the famine, but also a revival of insecurities that seemed to belong to the past. Fintan O'Toole has described the forces that destroyed the Celtic tiger as 19th century revenants come back to haunt its dreams of 21st century success. And many novels set in the post-crash period invoke the famine as the epitome of ruin, the acme of devastation, particularly in eviction, the ghost estates, and increased emigration. Annan writes The Green Road juxtaposes the Celtic tiger, property prices, and an encounter with a ruined famine cottage. And there are many famine echoes in the novel, including overt allusions to James Clarence Mangan's 1846 poem Dark Rosaleen, and in a chapter called The Hungry Grass, and this refers to the superstition that fairies make hungry grass show where generosity has failed to be shown, and anybody walking on this grass will begin to starve. In this chapter, we see Constance go to the supermarket for the Christmas shop, and she spends hundreds of pounds and buys every delicacy that can be imported, and yet forgets the potatoes. And she imagines herself digging some out of a field, lifting her head to howl, a vision which recreates the common scene of the discovery of the blight, which recurs in so many novels. Previous one, please. Paul Lynch has argued that there's no such thing as historical fiction because the consciousness of the writer and any articulation of a worldview are shaped by the heat and pressure of the times the writer lives in. Historical fiction is contemporary fiction, he says, and cannot be anything else. And it's certainly true that historical fiction always has one foot in the present, but this has always been the case. It's nothing new. Everyone remembers the opening of Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But they may not remember that he ends that opening paragraph with a pointed comparison between revolutionary France in the 1790s and England in the 1850s. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. In 20th and 21st century famine fiction, parallels are drawn with contemporary victims of famine, war, and other disasters, or they're used to underline the continuities of social injustice in Ireland itself. Lockwood, the English Quaker captain in Joseph O'Connor's Star of the Sea, returns to Ireland after the voyage to dedicate his life to the starving Irish because he's convinced of their generosity. So the next one, thank you. He says, "For as truly as the night comes down on every day, if the world were somehow turned downside up, if Ireland were a richer land and other nations now mighty were distressed, as certain as I know that the dawn must come, the people of Ireland would welcome the frightened stranger with that gentleness and friendship which so ennobles their character." And this is clearly a nudge to the 21st century reader, and it's underlined in interviews that O'Connor has given about the novel. He says, "You'd think because of our history we'd be incredibly welcoming and nice to immigrants, but we have the same levels of racism and xenophobia as any other country in Europe. It's as if our history means measurably nothing. The Irish don't seem to realize people from Africa and Eastern Europe are pretty much in the same position their ancestors were in the 1850s. Several famine novels are multi-generational, and they feature the discovery by a descendant of their ancestors' experiences, often through inheriting land or finding documents or coming to terms with what they've suffered or indeed what they've done. In Carol Birch's The Naming of Eliza Quinn, wealthy New Yorker Beatrice inherits a cottage in 1969 from her Irish grandmother, and it's a landscape that's haunted by famine. It's surrounded by ruined cottages. There are the ghosts of old potato ridges in the fields. And in a hollow tree, Beatrice finds the bones of a child. And the story that emerges is a series of injustices that have been committed by Beatrice's ancestors during the famine against the original owners of the cottage, the Quinns. Lizzie Vasey, who is Beatrice's great-great-grandmother, has planted a gun on the property so that Darby Quinn is transported and the family are eventually evicted. Her son takes the body of the child, Eliza Quinn, and spitefully hides it in the tree so that she's denied a proper burial. And we've heard earlier about how significant burial is in Irish culture. And her husband buys the land in 1848, and in the kind of later episodes in the novel, we see the resentment in the local community of the rise of the Vaseys through taking land from the evicted. The cottage retains its original name, Darby's Cottage, but the quins still exist on the margins in the novel's present. We're told that the churchyard is full of vases, but there are no quins there. They have left no mark, really, in the place apart from Darby's Cottage. One of the reasons why famine history is so conflicted is that issue of blame and resentment. And while there's a general consensus in literary texts that the British government failed dismally in its duties, and accusations range from genocide to more measured suggestions of incompetence and negligence. We see the public works scheme, for instance, a recurring motif in these novels of mismanagement. In Mildred Darby's 1910 novel, The Hunger, Tim Murphy starves to death working on the roads, along with many others, and the engineer hides the bodies, which are fatal evidences that someone in the pay department has blundered. The workhouses are unanimously places of terror rather than refuge. The exportation of food from a starving country, again, is a recurring motif in these novels and is consistently condemned. Even the son of the landlord in McCabe's Tales from the Poorhouse says, "No famine here, plenty of food. Ports should be closed and people fed." Charles Trevelyan appears in quite a few of these novels, and of course, usually he's the villain. Michael Nicholson, in his novel Dark Rosaleen, actually says he is the villain of the novel. And absentee or rapacious landlords and cruel agents are fixtures in these works. But I suppose the most odious figures in these novels are the people from within the community who seek to profit from their neighbours' distress, particularly those who grabbed land from the evicted, shopkeepers, Gombe men who hoarded food and inflated prices. And of course, we also see that in the folklore archive. So Ned Buckley of Knocknagree in County Cork remembered, "The people were never tired of discussing how some of those, taking advantage of the poverty of their neighbours, used to offer the rent of their farms to the landlord, the rent of which the owners could not pay, and grab their farms. Several people would be glad if the famine times were altogether forgotten, so that the cruel doings of their forebears would not be again renewed and talked about by neighbours." We can see a reflection of this in Nuala O'Phelan's novel My Dream of You, where the librarian Miss Lynch remembers the kind of uproar when she puts on an exhibition in the library about the famine for the 150th anniversary, and a local teacher suggests that the school children can digitize the records and put them online. She says, "But of course the records caused uproar. Everyone started going into what happened. How come so-and-so was admitted to the workhouse and their farm taken by the neighbours? Hadn't the big shops in town made a fortune out of supplying the workhouse? And at that, hadn't they cheated on every contract? Didn't so-and-so's great-grandfather get dismissed from supervising the women's ward because of the advantage he was taking of some of the poor women? Oh, I assure you, our own forebears were part of the system too, you know. None of the gentry around here died, but you can be sure our ancestors weren't out among the cabins of the dying any more than the gentry were. If you and I are sitting here in a warm room having a nice talk, we have to ask ourselves how our own people survived." Next slide, please. We can see in some of the marketing of famine novels the desire to present them optimistically as asserting Ireland's triumph over the horrors of the past. Bertie Ahern wrote an endorsement for Brendan Graham's The Whitest Flower, in which he identifies the central character, Ellen O'Malley, as the personification of Ireland and the resurrection of the new Ireland, rising out of starvation and disease. She's the embodiment of the hope that kept our people going, he says. And these covers proclaim it the triumph of one woman amidst Ireland's despair. A woman, a country, an epic story of inner strength and survival. And that symbolic identification between a woman and Ireland is, of course, very long-standing in literature and culture. Of course, there are recurring stories of survival and examples of self-sacrifice and tenderness, and those stories of parents trying desperately to get a proper burial for their child that we heard earlier are examples of that. or the husband warming his wife's feet on his breast while she dies. But a major preoccupation in these novels is the awful cost of survival to morality and civility. Under the stress of famine conditions, the mutual reliance of family and neighbours disintegrates into competition for food. Reverence for the dead gives way to the mass grave and the sliding coffin, or the consumption of corpses by dogs, pigs, and rats. In Joseph McGriena's Arantrá Hollow, which was published in 1929, Cahill finds the body of his friend Art in his cabin. He felt himself a little colder, a little emptier than before, and his heart a little sorer in his breast. If he and the man that was gone had ever spent a while happily in each other's company, he had forgotten it. He did not think of saying a prayer for the soul which had just torn itself painfully out of that wasted body. He had forgotten God, for it seemed that God had forgotten him a long time ago, ever since the blight came on the potatoes, since the beginning of the bad times. He sat there, bruised in sorrow. His soul inside him was like a dark pool, which no stream entered or left, but lay there in a numbing stillness under a sour coat of slime. Almost mechanically, Cahill ropes the corpse to his back to take it for burial. But he's starving, so he diverts to the soup kitchen, still carrying the corpse on his back. No one pays attention to the corpse. They're far too busy jostling for food, and we're told the pity the strong once had for the weak had vanished. Men were brushing aside women and children. Cahill tries to take advantage of two women fighting to reach beyond them to the soup cauldron, but he's pushed back by another man who threatens to stuff the corpse into the cauldron if he doesn't stay out. So again, a complete lack of reverence for the dead. So scenes of parents stealing food from their children or abandoning them, or as in William Trevor's The News from Ireland, mutilating them. The parents in that novel, they actually they burn the mark of the stigmata on the palms and the feet of their child in order to attract donations. So those kinds of examples of turning against family members are also frequent. The 19th century Italian novelist Alessandro Manzoni said of the historical novelist that you want him to put the flesh back on the skeleton that is history, to offer something richer, more complete. I think the famine novelist's role is even more difficult because they need to put the flesh back on the skeleton only to strip it back off again. They need to show us those living, breathing communities which are broken down through that process of starvation. Lynch suggests the famine is a very daunting subject because it takes the novelist into a very dark place, and he uses that as an example of one of the reasons why he thinks there is a silence in literature, that novelists are just a little bit frightened to take on such a dark story. He compares the author of a famine novel to Virgil guiding Dante through the Inferno. But famine novelists have consistently proven willing to travel to the very darkest places. Cormac O'Grada has referred to cannibalism as famine's darkest secret. It's a taboo topic. And yet it's frequently referred to in famine novels, often as a dark rumour, sometimes as an absolute certainty. And that's not modern. So in 1852, William Carleton refers in The Squanders of Castle Squander to a case of cannibalism in Connacht as one of 6 or 7 such scenes which occurred in Ireland during the last 4 years. A starving family, he tells us, have been 4 days without food. The 11-year-old James has just died, and his mother and siblings are fading fast. Carleton imagines in great detail the father's dilemma and final decision that the only choice he has to save himself and the others is to eat the body of his son. He tells James, "It is your own father that loved you as he did his own life that is going to do this evil and unnatural deed. But James, darling, life is sweet." The mother and the other children have already died, but the father is discovered by 2 policemen in the aftermath of his unhallowed meal, as it's described. And the judge at the trial sentences him to only 1 month, observing that the original instincts of the heart had been overcome and destroyed by the ferocity of famine. So the individualizing, the personalizing, the naming of the child are all hugely significant there. In O'Flaherty's Famine, Tomsey comes back from the island of Inishgola, where the people are eating one another in the villages after eating the cats and dogs. In Elizabeth Bird's 1972 novel, The Famished Land, Moira discovers her little brothers eating the body of their baby sister, and it's not entirely clear if she's dead before they begin eating. But she just closes the door. She walks out, closes the door, and is consoled by the neighbours who convince her that this is something which is instinctive and necessary, couldn't be helped. Another character tells her this isn't the first time it happened, for it happened before in the time of the hunger, and it's happening now, only nobody talks of it. Sean Kenny's 1995 novel, The Hungry Earth, ends with the protagonist's anguished discovery that his ancestors survived the famine through cannibalism. Paul Lynch's Grace herself is driven to cannibalism. She's a 14-year-old girl at the start of the novel, at the start of the famine. And there's an extended passage of the novel where her fragmented thoughts are represented as she's driven to this last recourse and digs up a body in the graveyard. She tries to persuade herself that she's eating anything else but what she actually is. Taste, chew, you want to live, do you not? Tell yourself, I said, it is cow, it is bull, it is sheep, it is hen. Yes, more taste. It is pig, it is goat, it is hare, it is rabbit, it is dog. No bother eating dog. The passage is followed by 4 completely blank pages to register either unconsciousness or the trauma of it, the break in memory, the inability to actually process what has happened. In 2018, Lynch declared himself baffled that the reviewers of Grace simply didn't mention that episode of cannibalism because he said for him it was a signal moment in the novel. And following his statement, there was an article. One reviewer decided to headline their article, Novel of Cannibalism in Great Famine Wins Book of the Year, which I imagine was equally frustrating for Lynch because that's not obviously all that the novel covers. And yet, even when Lynch was interviewed on French television in 2019, the subject was avoided yet again. Eve Jackson, the interviewer, refers to heartrending scenes in the novel, and she gives us as examples the scene where Grace's mother cuts her hair just before sending her out by herself to pretend she's a boy to work on the public roads, and the scene of Grace stealing seed potatoes. And she just leaves it there. So again, very strange that she makes no reference to it either. Lynch's suggestion that writers are put off by the gap in the record of the famine, the lack of testimony of those who suffered most, or that they're too daunted by the darkness of the period doesn't hold up. Gaps in the record are exactly what historical novelists are drawn to. It's their role to weave a story between these pages and between these gaps. It's their role to provide a voice for the silenced. It's notable, for example, that so many famine novels are written from the perspective of women and children who are often excluded from the historical record. These writers are also more than willing to take us into the darkest places in the human psyche and to expose us to the heartrending and the shocking and to disrupt complacent assumptions about recovery and distance. Miss Leach in Nuala O'Fwellan's My Dream of You says of the famine story that the central character, Kathleen, is writing, that it does exactly what a lot of the highbrow fiction coming into the library these days does. It keeps changing as you look at it. You don't know what to believe. Our readers hate that, of course. And that central character is actually somebody who starts by trying to write a non-fiction book about the famine and decides that because of the gaps and the ambiguity, she can't. So she ends up writing a novel. So it is possible to trace a sustained tradition of famine fiction from the 1840s to the present day. And the fact that these novels are being translated and read in other languages is, I think, significant too. It's not a story that simply has resonance for those of Irish heritage. I think all of these things suggest that there is more than a willingness on the part of both writers and readers to stand up to that challenge. Thank you.